This is the Jumper T20. If you don't know what it is their answer to many of the compact radios that we've seen land in the market in the last couple of months. It is an EdgeTX radio with ExpressLRS built in, and it has lots of nice features such as full-size gimbals available in Hall effect or ALPS sensors, lots of switches and buttons, and it's actually been a very popular choice with people looking to do fixed wing as well as quads. Now, the standard version came with a normal ExpressLRS module. However, Jumper have now released an upgraded version that I've got here with a built-in Gemini module. If you don't know what Gemini is, it is a new feature in ExpressLRS that offers better redundancy for your radio link over some of the other models. Now, what we're going to do today is give you a bit of a walkthrough of this radio. I'm not going to go quite as much into depth on this handset as I did in my initial review. I will put a link to that initial review in the description if you want to see it. And what we're then going to do is take a look at what has changed on this one compared to the original and have a bit of a dive into that new Gemini module. Just before we jump into the video, I just need to make it clear that Jumper did send me this handset over for free. They have not paid me to make this video. They have not seen this video. And as always, my thoughts are entirely my own. Okay, now for those who haven't seen, I do already have a full review on this radio, and I don't really intend to replicate that review here. What I'm going to do is give you a quick overview of this radio with regards to its buttons, controls and functions, and then we'll get on and talk about the differences between this one and the other T20. Now, this really is pretty much identical from the radio point of view. As you can see, when you get it, it comes in this nice case. If we unzip that, inside we'll find the radio itself. We've got the controller where they have these little foam pieces just to hold the sticks in place. Then in the top of the case, we've now got a neck strap as well as a USB cable. We've got our stickers to go over the buttons down here at the bottom. We've got some additional springs from the look of it hiding there. Yep, which is always handy to have. And then there looks to be a QA card that you get from Jumper with these radios. Now, the big difference between this one and the original T20 is the internal RF module and the antennas. Externally, though, everything else is exactly the same. Now, spec-wise, this radio is identical other than that ExpressLRS module. So it still comes with full-size gimbals available in both ALPS pots, like the ones I've got here, or with Hall effect sensors. We still have all of our usual switches. So, for instance, we have our two position switches on the top corners, 2 3-position switches on the front. You have your 2 pots down here in the middle, as well as 2 sliders. You've then got your 6 programmable buttons, your programmable trims here as well. And then flicking it around to the back, you still have the 2 corner buttons, which are latching. These pivot in from there, and then our 2 potentiometers there. It still has that same 1.3-inch OLED display. Whilst that is quite small, it does have a really nice look to it. I discussed this in my review, and whilst it is tiny, it isn't an issue for me. I think it's a really nice display. It's really bright and nice and easy to see all of the controls and functions. Obviously, if you're someone that wears glasses or may struggle with smaller stuff, it might be a bit of a challenge, but for me, it's absolutely fine. The radio does come with EdgeTX as standard, and you can access that via the buttons at the bottom. So for instance, if you press and hold, we can go into the menus, or we can just press and scroll through. And whilst it doesn't have all of the buttons, there are some multi-use buttons here. For instance, there isn't a dedicated mode and menu button. You've just got a dual button here, as well as the back button. There's just one, so press and hold or just press and release. It still gives you all of the usual controls. Overall, the other real big change on this radio is the antenna. That is now a dual antenna setup. Rather than having that single antenna that folded out from the back before, now you've got this dual antenna which moves around like that for the Gemini system. And what we'll do is we'll take a bit of a closer look at how that's connected in the radio later on. On the back, you'll find the fan which cools the internal ExpressLRS module. Now, this one has that new Gemini module. Rather than it being a single module, it is a dual module capable of up to 500 milliwatts of output on each channel, and it supports that Gemini functionality, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the video. Under the cover, you've got that XT30 DC output, which is 7.4 volts, 1.5 amps, and then you've got a port that connects onto that external module bay option, allowing you to put on nano modules. Then on the back we have our battery bay. This is actually quite a tough one to get open. And in there, you'll find the battery holder. This actually takes two 21-700s. You can actually squeeze in some 18-650s into these if you really want to, but they are designed for 21-700s. And then we've simply got our DC input for that down there on the side, or you can plug a LiPo straight into this if you wanted to. Now, the biggest change externally on this radio is the antennas, because on the top here, we have these two integrated folding antennas for the built-in Gemini module. Now, if you don't know what Gemini is, it is a dual ExpressLRS system that allows it to transmit two packets at the same time on separate frequencies. Now, I did cover this in a different video where I was looking at a Gemini module from Beta FPV, and what I think I will do is cut in a section of that video into this just to explain exactly what Gemini is. There are multiple different modes of operation for ExpressLRS with regards to packet rate and types of output. So for instance, you've got your normal operating modes, which is your LoRa modes. These are the ones that are, say, 50 Hz to 250 or onwards, and these basically work by taking a packet of data, sending it, moving on to a new frequency, and sending a new packet of data again. You then have your D modes, which is your redundancy modes. These work by sending multiples of the same packet to try and ensure that the data gets through. For instance, in D250, it will actually send the same packet 4 times, but this is done serially rather than in parallel. So basically, it will send the packet, jump frequency, send the same packet again, jump frequency, send the same packet, say twice, and then move on to new data. This does add a lot of latency, but it does add a massive improvement in performance, especially in heavily RF congested areas. The real key to understand with the D modes, though, is that it is serial and not parallel, and I'll come on to that subject a bit more in a minute when we come back to Gemini. Then you have your F modes, which is the FLRC modes. These are by far the fastest modes with the lowest latency. However, they also have the worst overall RF performance. If you were to use Gemini in, say, D250 mode, rather than it sending the 4 packets on 3 frequencies that I mentioned earlier, it will actually send 8 packets on 6 frequencies, with the 2 4s acting in parallel, again on separate frequencies. The real key to understand with Gemini is you're basically taking 2 transmitters and 2 receivers, putting them into one unit and parallelizing up the data. So rather than the data being sent serially, it's sending 2 separate pieces of data at exactly the same time. Now, as I've mentioned, I do have a far more detailed video talking about Gemini, and I will put a link to that in the description. The very basics with Gemini are, though, it isn't designed to give you out and out more range. It is designed to give you more redundancy. ExpressLRS already has redundancy modes built in, such as the D modes, which transmit your packets serially, so it'll transmit the same packet twice. The problem with that, though, is it might transmit that on the same frequency. What Gemini does is transmit the same packet on 2 different frequencies at the same time. Whereas D modes give you redundancy but add latency, Gemini gives you redundancy without the latency penalty, because it is transmitting the packets at the same time, and if one gets missed, the other one will get picked up. The thing to understand, though, with Gemini is you also need to use a Gemini compatible receiver. It doesn't offer the full functionality with a standard receiver. Just like the transmitter has to have 2 RF front stages, it is exactly the same on the receiver side, and it isn't just antenna diversity it needs a receiver with that full dual RF front end as well, and there are receivers available from pretty much all of the manufacturers on this now. Overall, what Gemini is going to do is help with link performance in heavily RF congested environments. Just looking around the rest of the radio, you've then got your USB port up the top there for upgrading the firmware on the radio, as well as the ExpressLRS Module 2, I believe, but we will check that in a minute. Now, putting the original T20 next to the new Gemini version, you can see they're pretty much identical apart from the antennas. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the RF output on this radio isn't the same as the original one. This one came with 1 watt of RF power in ExpressLRS, whereas the Gemini version is limited to 500 milliwatts max on both transmitters, so that is dual 500. Jumper don't actually mention this in their marketing material, and they're not really saying that this one comes with half the power of this one, but it is something I did want to highlight. Really, when it comes down to choosing these two radios, you're making a choice between pure RF power and redundancy, and what you've got to decide is what is most important to you. It's also worth me mentioning at this point that neither of these radios' ExpressLRS modules have the backpack functionality either. Jumper have chosen not to build that into their ExpressLRS modules, and as a result of it, if you did want the backpack function, you're going to have to modify the radio separately. That, in my opinion, is a big mistake. I think all of the transmitter manufacturers today should be including backpack as standard. However, it isn't something particularly new to the Gemini one. It is the case on both of these handsets. Now, with regards to EdgeTX on this radio, everything is pretty much the same. So you have all of the usual options available through the menus. You have all of the model menus and everything. I'm not going to go into EdgeTX too much in this. With regards to that ExpressLRS module, it's the same way you access all of the settings for that as you do on all of the others. So if I press and hold and go into the menus, and then if we go into the ExpressLRS Lis Script, here we'll have all the options for it. What I'll do is zoom in a bit more on the screen and then show you the new options that are available for the Gemini module specifically. So walking you through the Lis Script, the first thing to note is you have all of the usual settings you'd come to find in ExpressLRS. So we have our packet rate, our telemetry ratio, our switch mode. There's a new antenna mode, which is our Gemini settings, which we'll come on to in a minute. We've then got a model match and all of our usual options listed under here. Now, as I have mentioned already, this radio is fitted with that dual 500 milliwatt module, but it is worth noting that the Lis Script will actually allow you to select up to 1000. I will talk about this a bit more in a minute, but the maximum output this radio is capable of is 500 milliwatts. However, you may want to select the 1000 because in some of my RF testing, whilst the 500 mode gets to about 420 milliwatts, the 1000 mode pushes it to basically the 500 max. If we go back, we then have that new option, which, as I mentioned, is called antenna mode. Now, the way, as I've said, Gemini works is it will basically transmit the same mode on two antennas on different frequencies. So the packet rate you select will be replicated across the two transmitters. So at the moment, we've got it set to 250 Hertz, and if I go down under the antenna mode, you can see it's currently on switch. This isn't actually a Gemini mode. This is basically diversity at this point. It will switch antennas to decide which one to use for the best signal, but it won't use both of them at the same time. We then also have the option to manually select which output we want, so antenna 1 and antenna 2, and by selecting that you're actually selecting the full RF path for that. So if you wanted to manually set it to 1 or 2, you can. That basically turns it into a standard ExpressLRS transmitter. You're just choosing which one you want to use. The final option is then Gemini, which then replicates whatever mode you're on both antennas, but on different frequencies. So for instance, we're on 250 Hertz, so that mode would be 250, with each antenna transmitting that on different frequencies on the band. The one thing you do need to understand with Gemini though is you are doubling up on the transmission, and as a result of that you're going to use more battery power because it's transmitting twice as much data at the same time. Overall, everything else under here is exactly the same, and it allows you to do all of the usual things that you'd be able to do in ExpressLRS. So you've got your manual power settings, you've got your VTX administration, your Wi-Fi connectivity, as well as your Bluetooth joystick options as well. And then you've got the bind option. Overall, what Gemini is going to do is give you a lot more options. You've got that diversity mode with it switching between the antennas, single antenna choice 1 or 2, or that Gemini that replicates the output on both. Okay, next to give you a walk around of what this new module is like inside. Now, I've already torn the radio down. It's quite easy to do on this. You need to remove the rubber covers from either side over here and here. If you then flip it over, you need to remove 2 screws on either side there and there. There's 1 screw on either side in the battery bay. There's 2 very small screws in those 2 little holes there. And then you've got 2 screws up here that hold the antenna in place. When you've undone that, it all comes loose. And then if you very carefully split the shell, inside, you'll start to see you gain access to the inside of the radio. What there is on this radio is bits that go between both sides. And when I say bits, I mean wires. You can see them crossing over there. There is one down here at the bottom, which you're going to want to undo. The easiest place to undo that from is on this bottom PCB here. That'll start to allow the radio to tip backwards. And then we've got two wires that come over from this board here to here, one for the module and one for that DC board. And the wires actually cross. So the wire on this top board goes to the left-hand port and the wire on the module goes to the right-hand port, but they actually cross over. So it's worth just remembering that as you undo them. Then what we'll do carefully is undo them, and then we're able to flip the radio over, and then that leaves some just additional cables between the radio itself and the back, and that is for those controls on the corners. So again, what we're going to do is very carefully undo these, allowing us to then completely separate off the back. The only thing that is left is the two antennas. They're on UFLs and they go to the module on the back there. So what I'm going to do is very carefully release the UFL connections. We don't want to damage these, and there we can then separate out the back from the front. Now, if you want a closer look at this radio on the inside, as I've said, I do cover that in the original video. The version I've got here is the one with the Alps pots. You can see them there and them there. That is those Alps potentiometers that are going to give that just traditional feel to the gimbals. They're good quality pots. I'm not going to go too much more into that in this video, but again, it is available in a Hall effect version as well. What is nice about this radio is that it does have full-size gimbals, and we're already seeing people do lots of nice, cool mods for it. Other than that, though, everything in here is pretty much exactly the same. We have a multi-board setup, so we have the main PCB with our ARM chipset. We've then got this power I/O board up here, display board, power board down here with a battery on, as well as our rotary gimbal. We've then got some more I/O, the speaker and the switches around the corners. Now, just giving you a closer look at this new Gemini module in this radio, you can see it's labelled at the top there, T20 ELRS Gemini, 2.4 gigs, 500 milliwatts, so that'll be 500 on each side. It does have a TCXO as well, which is great to see. Now, if you look around at the setup, it is pretty much the same as what we had on the others. So you have your main ESP32 chipset, you then have your two RF chipsets. We'll have a look at them under the microscope in a minute just to see what they are. And then you have your little power amplifier there, heading out to the RF stage, and basically everything is doubled up. So whilst you've got one ESP32, you have two independent RF front end stages, which means it can basically act independently from an RF point of view and transmit packets at the same time on two separate frequencies. Now, the board is mounted directly to this heatsink. There does seem to be some glue there holding it in. And then obviously, as I showed earlier, that is cooled by that built-in fan on the back. Now, this is removable and replaceable, and you could put a module bay adapter on the back of this radio if you wanted to. You can see there's some screws there that allow you to take this off, so you could still use it with an external module. They do have an adapter plate for that, but you are going to need to buy that because there's no JR bay or nano adapter as part of this radio as standard. Now, before I give you my final thoughts, I just want to talk about the RF power output. I have done tests on this module on both ports, and it will output just under 500 milliwatts on each side, 485 or something like that. What I would say is it is absolutely capable of delivering the power output that they say. Okay, now just to share with you some final thoughts on the T20 with Gemini. Now, overall, the radio itself hasn't changed. So it has all of the great benefits that the T20 has. Full-size width radio, full-size gimbals, lots of switches, EdgeTX, and again, I do like that OLED screen. Whilst it's small, I find that absolutely fine, and I do like these kind of OLEDs on radios. It also, though, has some of the downsides as well, as I mentioned in my original review. For instance, those top corner buttons on the top there are quite hard to get to. They're a bit fiddly. I think they overdid what they were trying to do on the corners. You've got that pot as well as the button, and the button isn't particularly comfortable to use because it hinges on that corner. I personally would have preferred one side to have had a full-size button, this side specifically for me, and then that side maybe to have the pot. I think they've just tried to cram a bit too much onto them. However, overall, the radio is exactly the same as the original T20, and many people have come to love this radio over the last few months. I've seen a really big modding scene appear around this radio because it uses full-size gimbals. You can put in CNC gimbals from one of the other big manufacturers as well, the AGO ones, and I've seen people do lots of nice things, and it sits in a position between some of the biggest radios, like, say, the TX16 size, but it's not as small as, say, a Pocket. Boxer-wise, it's sort of in that category, but there are many people who prefer this over that because it is a full-width radio. It's nice to see them also bring that Gemini to this model as well. It isn't going to be needed for everyone, but it is there if you want it. And what's also great to see is if you already own a T20, you can actually upgrade your radio to Gemini. They've made an upgrade kit available too. And if you want to get that, I'll put a link to both the radio and that upgrade kit in the description. And it means that you're not getting left behind if you had the original module. Now, price-wise, the Jumper T20 with the Gemini module is available for $199, and as I've said, you can also get the upgrade kit for the existing T20. This includes the main board, the heatsink, the back cover, as well as the new antennas, and that's available for $59.90 as well. In the UK, it's £165.92 for the radio and £49.70 for the module. Overall, what they've done here isn't dramatic, but it is a nice improvement, and if you're interested in getting one, there will be a link to it in the description. Finally, I just want to say a big thank you to Jumper for sending this one over. If you're interested in seeing that original review, I will put a link to that in the description as well. I know I've said that several times, but it will be there, as well as the Beta FPV review talking about Gemini in a lot more detail. We actually get it onto a spectrum analyzer as well. Now, I'm really interested in hearing what you think about this radio, your thoughts. If you have any questions, put them in the comments and I will try and answer them. I also just want to say, if you'd like to support the channel to allow us to keep making content in the future, please do consider checking out our Patreon as well as Buy Me a Coffee. We also now have channel memberships available on this channel, and I want to say a big thank you to everyone who has supported us via that, as well as all of the supporters on Patreon. We would not be able to keep making content on this channel without your support, and if you'd like to support us in the future to keep allowing us to make content, please do consider checking it out. Anyway, that's it from me. Stay safe. I'll speak to you soon.